Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Harold Holzer, and I have the privilege of serving as the new, I still say new for another few weeks, Jonathan Fanton, director of the Roosevelt House. And on behalf of Hunter President Jennifer Rabb, who extends her greetings and who may show up and sit in on some of the conference if she gets out of a meeting, I want to welcome all of you to Roosevelt House. As someone who's worked in state government and now the academic world, it's a real pleasure to welcome the Hopkins Hunter Education Forum back here for the second of these collaborative events, with many more we hope to follow. And especially to welcome the new, if he is still saying that as I am, the new director of the Hopkins Institute for Education Policy, Professor David Steiner, who has created such huge footprints in both worlds, government and education, and still clearly remains part of the Hunter family and the Roosevelt House family. You can't leave that relationship. So we're meeting at an awfully fraught moment in terms of discussions of curriculum and content. Education and higher education issues, if not issue-driven, then controversy-driven, are making such huge news on the internet and in the mainstream media, with students so passionately insisting on safe places to learn and live, college presidents and provosts falling by the wayside when they fail to do so, hunger strikes, football team sick outs. It's really Halloween controversies. It's an interesting moment. Just the other day, a principal in New York City likened testing to slavery and cocaine. And Rod Page came right back and said testing is important. So this is an incredible moment to have this discussion. And I will quote Roosevelt, as I like to do in my new role. Roosevelt in 1938 said in a radio address, "Upon our educational system must largely depend the perpetuity of those institutions upon which our freedom and our security rests." Good line and a timeless line. So I want to welcome everyone, having all of the panelists here, Michelle Allen, Valerie Lewis, Ian Rowe, and David Coleman. David, I just have to say before we start, and before I turn the program over to David Steiner, I don't know if you know that I always think of your family during Thanksgiving. And let me explain. My daughter was a perfectly rational Thanksgiving guest until she went to the summer writers program at Bennington when your mother was president of Bennington, where you had to do two things, write and shun meat. It has been very difficult to do Thanksgiving for her ever since. So that's your legacy. You're stuck with it. It's a good thing we have this really important issue to discuss, so that would be the lead. Let me turn the program over to our friend David Steiner.
Thank you so much. I often begin by fairly formal words of welcome, but this is a topic that's just different. This is something of a private and public passion for me. When I had the privilege of being Commissioner of Education in New York, there were many things I did that, as so many commissioners do, one would do differently if one had the time again. There was one thing I did which everyone told me not to do. And unsurprisingly, it turned out to be the thing that I'm probably proudest of. And that is that within the $700 million ask, I snuck in $25 million for curriculum. And I was told not to do it because, as you all know, the federal government is deeply sensitive to the charge of getting involved in this subject. But the idea of moving ahead with new standards, with Common Core, with everything else, with nothing to give to teachers in terms of curriculum struck me and my principal deputy, John King, as just wrong. And the result of that has been Engage New York, which so far has had 22 million hits. And I think has begun a movement towards showing the central hunger that teachers have across this country for rich curriculum material. It is impossible to know where this will end just as well, because bright, smart people across the country are taking it in exciting directions which we could not have imagined. But it is clearly not an end and barely a beginning. And that's why it's a particular joy for me to have this group of people and all of you here tonight to think about where we go from here. I can't think of anyone better to start this conversation than an old friend and an admired colleague, David Coleman. David gave his first public remarks about Common Core at an Albany gathering when I was commissioner. They were, as usual, barely noticed. However, it's been some years since then, and David has himself moved on, of course, to the College Board and responsible for all the changes that are being made there and the crucial link between 12th and what I call 13th grade, first grade of college. David has shown enormous courage and thoughtfulness in leading this country in many ways in its educational debates. And tonight it's a great privilege to welcome him again, because the last time he was in this house with me was the launch of the CUNY Institute for Education Policy, which is the forefather of what we have tonight. David.
Tonight is a great night for New York City. Does anyone know why? David Steiner is back in the house. How exciting. How exciting is this news for us all? You have not moved on, good sir. We shall reclaim you as a child of our city. I really think David's a very special guy, David Steiner. He, as he said, took a stand that the daily work of what teachers do, what's put in front of them and kids, the texture of the materials they encounter, is of the utmost importance to anyone who cares about the educational life of teachers and kids. And he took a solitary stand on that point. And what I love about David is for him, love is continuous. That is, he shall not waver. He will fight for this idea that content and knowledge matters, and his enduring commitment to that through every rise and fall will have an accumulated force of great power. And he shows me all the time of what it is to hold an idea through different positions and changes of location. Be careful, Baltimore. I would imagine that hunger cry from David will be at your border step, and it should be soon. I hope most of what I say next will show my sense of obligation and tribute to the ideas, some of the ideas he's dedicated his life to, but I'm entirely convinced by his central proposition. The notion that rich content and the knowledge we gain by the encounter with it is an essential, fundamental cornerstone of education is undeniable. The only thing that's super weird is how that self-evident fact does not have more force in the daily life of American learning. That's troubling and requires us to reflect. But I feel that, so David, welcome back to New York. Hooray that you are here. I think discussions of grand topics like knowledge and learning tend to leave detail alarmingly behind. So I want to break my comments into two parts. The first thing I want to talk about is the founding documents of this country and the great conversation of liberty and human dignity that they inspire. And I'll tell you why I'm talking about that and how. And I want to show you something very specific about the interactive Constitution. So if we want to debate or discuss whether knowledge matters, let's talk about knowledge that matters and decide whether it matters enough that we should fight for it. And then second, I'll make some, hopefully not tedious general remarks on the role of knowledge and learning to introduce the panel. And be ready when I reach the panel for your attacks and questions. Some old friends are here, so I'm particularly terrified of their long-nursed objections, but I'll deal with that when they come. Think of the SAT. The SAT, which is a fairly well-known exam, has been for a long, long time seen as an exam whose content would be somewhat mysterious. Cloaked first in the notion of aptitude, which is a fairly mysterious notion. You're able to do something. What it is, I can't tell you. Were you born with it? Did you earn it? Who knows? Right? We have completed, as you may know, a redesign of the SAT. And I can tell you this quite simply. The notion of foggy, mysterious aptitude is banished from this exam. This exam invites the notion of productive practice. It says, yes, you can get better at these things by doing them well. Things like reading carefully and attending to evidence as you do so. Such humble things as being able to read a literary text with care, but also a scientific one where data and information integrates with the text you read on a page. It turns out there are 3 domains of mathematics to know, especially in depth, reward you heavily. So we made them 80% of the math exam. We want to encourage a practice, and I think this is critical, that is focused so you don't despair. It is not helpful to say to someone, know everything or practice everything. If a student is behind in particular, this becomes a moment of total anxiety and retreat. Can you dare to name certain things that are particularly worthy of practice? Do you see what I'm trying to say? It's easy to say knowledge is important, but can we go even further and say there are certain things to know well that so reward your attention that we're going to devote ourselves to them? Think about it. The SAT seems the opposite of that, right? It's got to be a surprise. You're not allowed to know. But then I announced last year that on every single SAT, PSAT exam, one of the 5 passages would be one of the founding documents of this country or the great global conversation of freedom and human dignity they inspire, period. I said it might be more interesting, rather than reading a tedious long test prep book, to read Lincoln and King. So on the last PSAT, does anyone know who the passage was from? It's interesting. It was the 4th of July address by Frederick Douglass. I could give away a secret. I could say someday Nelson Mandela will be on one of our exams. Read all of him. Beat me back. Take advantage of the hints I'm giving you. We say as the College Board that it is disproportionately powerful. It opens up worlds of opportunity for students if they know this brief, powerful documents, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration, and the conversation they inspire through Lincoln, King, and others. We staked a claim by giving them that real estate on the exam. Students now with confidence can study those and get the advantages of being more familiar with it. They can enter a conversation and find value in that. So one thing that I think we've made a mistake of is it is easy to preach at people that they ought to know certain things. It is something that people often do at cocktail parties where they think that everyone should know all the things that they know. And they say the kids these days, they should know what I know, basically. But what if we said, as the College Board has begun to do, that if we're going to require something, if we're going to say you must know this, that we must make the tools for learning it as free as possible. You notice we did this with test preparation. That is, we used to kind of say, oh, there's this test prep happens on this side of the world, but it's not our fault. We made a good test. There's this narrow test preparation. Well, in all candor, while it is not our fault, it most certainly is our problem. That is, the fact that costly test preparation arose around the SAT and reinforced everyone's idea that these were not tools of merit, but rather reinforced the inequities that are tearing apart our society is not okay. That's why we announced with Khan Academy that we would provide free test prep for the world. And I could go off on that, which is very interesting, but what it's really about is knowledge. It's about practicing. Test preparation is for one thing. You prepare for a test so you can do that one thing well. Practice is for everything. It is to gain a facility and a knowing by heart. It's a skill that you can broadly apply. It is a skill and knowledge that you can broadly apply. So, since we had required that students would be acquainted with the founding documents, we immediately partnered with the Constitution Center to provide the first free interactive Constitution. I just want to kind of show it to you and then talk about what I think is here of value. So, just in case you're interested, any of you can go to constitutioncenter.org, Interactive Constitution, and this resource is for you to free. So let's explore it. By the way, I fear technology, and so the amount of errors I'm about to make should give you all comfort, because this is live and I will mess up. So just watch and enjoy as I stumble through it. So let's look at it. Here are the amendments to the Constitution. If I click on one, like the freedom of religion, a very interesting thing happens. We get first an essay written by quite impressive legal scholars. This is combined by the leading, what some would call on the right, Federalist Society scholars, and leading on the left scholars. And they come to Marcy Hamilton and Michael McConnell, who represent quite divergent points of view in our society, first provide us a common interpretation of what the shared facts of the amendment are. It's almost like our society as we dream it could be, where people on both sides would first agree on a core set of facts that they can imply. So they've written that brief essay. They're well written and clear. And then and this is who they are. And then they make their case for interpreting it differently. Do you see what it is? It's first, here's what we both see in common, then how do we see it differently? So as students, they gain command of the core of what the text implies and must mean, or what follows from it, and then how it might be different. But let's say we wanted to go further in looking at the Constitution. What then this allows you to do, if I can get there, is it allows you to take an amendment and trace it around the globe. This is kind of groovy. So, for example, what's happening with the freedom of religion globally? These are the countries that have the freedom of religion enshrined in some aspect of their constitutions. If I click on one of them, like Brazil, I see exactly how it plays out in the Brazilian constitution. More importantly, I see a word-by-word analysis of how close or different it is. We spend a lot of time hoping students will pay attention to each word. A good reader cares about those kinds of choices the author makes. Nowhere are those word choices more evidently consequential than in something like our Constitution or the amendments that grant us our basic rights and liberties. The reason I show you this, and there's a lot more to show, for every amendment you can see its drafting history and you can see how it develops over time. I could spend a lot more time showing you, but it shows you how the amendment was developed and refined. It shows you changes in words over time for each of them. Madison's original proposal, how it was refined by someone else, the fights that broke out. To me, though, what I want to offer you here is think about the human being who knows this versus that person who does not for a minute. Like, let's get really concrete. The person who knows this sees the power of words coursing through the world. They see a conversation between people refining and making those words different. A lot of students experience intellectual life without a sense of that conversation happening. They just see the finished product. It's like this dead given thing. But what about seeing it come alive through debate and intense disagreement, finding more and more powerful words to achieve a different kind of union and solution? What about seeing scholars debate over each of those words and devoting their lives to it? I think that the founding documents and the great conversation they inspire encapsulates, as it were, the gift and power of knowledge. To be quite concrete, and to say something perhaps a little more controversial, if you are a black person in this country, if you are trying to make it into society, it is a very powerful thing to know the founding documents, the great conversation. I think it has disproportionate power for those who are not majority members of our society. If you take the case of Barbara Jordan, the great congresswoman from Texas. I'm sure you all know of Barbara Jordan. But do you know the moment she earned her colleagues' respect? It was when she gave the speech on Nixon's impeachment. And she spoke, she says, I am an inquisitor. And she schooled the rest of those around her on the meaning of the Federalist Papers and what impeachment meant and did not mean at that time and what that meant for their work today. One by one, her white colleagues sat down and paid attention. These words are power. To have command of them exerts a force. And I focus on this because I think it's about time we made very clear that education is about college and career readiness, but it is also a soul craft. It has to do with civic readiness. It has to do with a broad set of things. We dare, as educators, to name things of value that are worth knowing by heart. And I think it's time we asserted that as educators, and we've tried to do that as the College Board. In every PSAT, beginning in 8th to 9th grade, annually, every year, one of the founding documents in Great Conversation, we've added $180 million in scholarships to PSAT, more than national merit. So it literally repays your attention, if I could be trivial, to study this with care. So if you look at the interactive Constitution, I'm asking you to think about the consequences of a kid for whom this is not available to them versus one who is. And do we prefer that? I'll say just a couple more words about the role of knowledge. I think that one of the things that's really hurting us, and I find very common, is the casual contempt for memory. There's barely an education meeting I am in where someone does not dismiss rote learning as the most ruthless and cruel form of learning. Why? No smaller a thinker than Plato ventures in the Meno that learning is recollection. What I'm trying to say is not mere rote memory, but hard-earned, not mere rote learning, but hard-earned memory, learning things by heart is, in my candid opinion, at the center of many disciplines. In poetry, there is no understanding of meter. You'll never get it by memorizing beats. You memorize it by learning poems by heart and gradually, one day, learning how a phrase that a poet used, oh, that's how it's said. And then you feel the meter as a hand on your heart. In mathematics, without memory of the core operations, in my humble view, we should virtually ban calculators in elementary school. Because elementary school, not that kids should not learn to manipulate calculators in elementary school, but my point is a deeper one. You'll love this, but Plato also argued that the Egyptian god Thoth invented writing to destroy memory. So he was worried about writing as a tool that would destroy memory. I worry we should worry about some technologies that seem to convince us that, so Google does not destroy the need for knowledge held within. Don't be silly. Calculators don't mean that your ability to calculate and understand what you're doing when you do math doesn't really matter. But they give us the illusion that it does. One thing I love about the interactive constitution is my anxiety is the technology of interruption has far outpaced the technology of concentration. Cell phones, email, all these things do not cultivate the sustained concentration and attention that great work in math, literacy, history, science, or love requires, I might add. And this technology invites you to concentrate. It invites you to dare to pay special attention to something, to lavish an attention on it. Linda knows from core knowledge that I feel this is equally true about the life of kids in their youngest ages. By focusing on saying the founding documents, I don't want to ignore that I think one of the clearest cases for a coherent and general knowledge is for our tenderest kids in pre-K, first grade, second grade. That general knowledge, why have the youngest children read and be read aloud incoherent things when they could gain rich, coherent knowledge through conversation? They can talk at a much higher level. They can read themselves. Why not have those conversations? Why not restore the rightful role of elementary school teachers as the guides to the world? Why limit ourselves narrowly to English and math? In the revised SAT, something that most people have not noticed, and I'm about to conclude, is that there are subscores. You know, in high school, it's equally destructive that we only measure English and math because we ignore the fundamental role, evidently, not to speak of the arts, that history and science play. So the new SAT has subscores in analysis in history and analysis in science, not just in reading and math, to acknowledge the core team that through their shared effort prepares students. So I think we have to pay attention to how testing in reading and math may have reinforced people's prejudices that skills rather than knowledge are fundamental, because the disciplines they associate with knowledge, although math clearly entails it and literacy does too, especially literature, by neglecting those, we've reinforced these very bad ideas. So my hope is that if we are willing, I think the country and parents and families are hungering for education to be soul food, to prepare their children, but also to be worth doing and worthy of their future. And I think if we begin to invest heavily in beautiful things worth knowing and acknowledge the power of memory rather than only its limitations, there may be a way forward. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much, David. We have a wonderful panel of those who are really in the trenches, who are doing the hard work. Those of us who are privileged to be in the academy sometimes forget that it's every day and every child, and these are the people who are with the children every day. Let me ask each of you to reflect for a few moments on your own work in the context of this topic, what the curriculum means where you are, how you think about its role given the current contexts that were referred to at the very beginning. What does it mean each day for you, for the work you do, for the work that, in 2 cases at least, your teachers and your students are doing? Bring us down to the best place of all, which is the classroom. Do you want to start?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ian Rowe. I'm the CEO of Public Prep, which is a nonprofit network of single-gender public charter schools here in New York City. We have 6 campuses, about 1,500 students, and we are very inspired by the topic tonight. Our schools are pre-K through 8th grade, and I think we several years ago came to the conclusion that the dominant ideology, this idea that young children should learn to read, then read to learn as a sequential process was just wrong. And that needed to be happening in parallel. This idea that we didn't need to protect kids from really rich content and that our elementary school teachers shouldn't be gatekeepers around this very important content, particularly for the populations that we serve, very low-income kids in the South Bronx, Lower East Side. If we weren't teaching this content, where in the world was this going to happen? And that's the conclusion that we came to. And so we embarked upon our adventure. We worked with the Core Knowledge Foundation to really start to build what we believed was a very rich content-driven curriculum. But here's the challenge that we ran into. The intellectual preparation to really master this rich content cannot be overestimated. I think our teachers, particularly in elementary school, we have a vision of teachers in elementary school who are the singular foundations of knowledge, right? They have to teach science, they have to teach math, they have to teach history, they've got to be the person that connects with the child. They've got to do all of these things. And the problem actually was not that the children could not absorb this rich content. It was much more a factor of could the adults in the building really effectively master the content to then effectively teach it. And that's something that we've been spending a lot of time on trying to resolve. We wish we could transform colleges of education so that they would be producing graduates who are not only rich in pedagogy, but also strong in science and math and understand the Federalist Papers. Maybe they need to go see Hamilton or something like that. So what we've actually decided on, David just said something interesting. This idea of sustained concentration is very important. So what we've actually decided to do in our elementary schools is this idea of focus, not only for the students but for the adults. And I'll end shortly. But this idea that we've actually decided to essentially departmentalize our elementary schools. So I think we're one of the only schools in all of New York City that has dedicated science teachers. So beginning in kindergarten, we have faculty who teach nothing but science. And we found that that has been enormous for them in terms of focus, because guess what? They don't have to worry about all of these other topics. They can just become really masterful at teaching science. We then decided, okay, well, maybe there's a similar phenomena in math. And so we now have dedicated math teachers beginning at 3rd grade, meaning that we have teachers who teach nothing but math beginning in elementary school. The power of that is that it allows those teachers to really focus, learn their craft, really dive deep. This idea of sustained concentration applies as much to the adults as it does to the children. What it also does is that for our lead teachers who are now only need to focus on literacy and history, they can also dive deeply into the founding documents and everything else that we decide is really important for our kids to learn. And so that's the bet that we're taking, that sustained concentration to give our teachers the ability to really focus, and then also, by the way, create planning time so that the literacy teacher, the math teacher, and the science teacher come together on a regular basis to talk about what's the common vocabulary across these disciplines, what is the interdisciplinary impact of a theme that might cross all of these areas, we found to be very, very powerful. So that's how we are on the ground tackling this problem and opportunity.
Hi, so my name is Michelle Allen. I'm the principal of Icon Charter School 4. I've had the privilege of working alongside Jeffrey Litt, who did a lot of work with Edie Hirsch. So I came up in the network, and I've been with the Icon schools for about 14 years. So I've had the pleasure of actually teaching core knowledge. I was a social studies teacher, and I really was able to see the impact that a content-rich curriculum had with students. The first thing that comes to mind when I think about that is how a content-rich curriculum levels the playing field. So when we talk about students that may or may not have access, so when they go home, whether or not their parents are affluent, or whether or not the parents just have know-how in terms of how to move their child forward, when we have schools where students come where we have schools where students come and they're really enriched in a very sound educational background, I think that that's well worth anything else that we could possibly do. We also have at the Icon Charter Schools, the way that he was talking about departmentalizing, we've actually started moving in that direction as well. So for me, it just kind of makes sense that if you have classroom teachers that are both teaching the same grade level, that their lesson plan should be identical. Their project should be identical. What's best practice in one classroom should be exactly what's going on in the other room as well. I think sometimes there's a very big notion in terms of competition amongst teachers to make sure that my lesson plans look better than the other ones, and my bulletin boards look better than the other teachers. But it's, I'm sorry, I'm just a little nervous.
No, sing it.
Yeah. But the best example that I can give in terms of even spiraling with core knowledge is when I first started with the Icon Network. I was teaching second grade social studies, and there was someone else. His name is Brian Geelan. He's actually now the principal of Icon 6. He was also teaching the same content area in 5th grade. And it was great because we can come together on one central concept and just kind of really delve deep and take a look at perspectives. So if I was teaching the Civil War in 2nd grade and he was teaching that same content in 5th grade, we had this really rich conversation between the 2nd graders and the 5th graders, and how we were able to collaborate and come together on a common thread. So it's very important to make sure that when things are taught to students in our classrooms, it's not just dropped and it's not just left. And I think that core knowledge really has a way of coming back and spiraling and making sure that the kids really understand content. So even though it's something that may be, it may be something that's a bit over their heads at a particular grade level, it's assured that later on it's going to come back around where they can really delve deeper into that subject matter.
Good evening. My name is Valerie Lewis, relatively newly retired principal from the New York City Department of Education. I was fortunate enough when I was a teacher to come across E.D. Hirsch's work on content knowledge. And I was very fortunate that I worked under a principal who listened to me when I said to her, our children are working hard, our teachers are working hard, but we're not getting anywhere, we're not thinking. It's more about math, it's more about reading. We received a grant from New York State at the time. It was called the Comprehensive School Reform Grant. It was for failing schools. We weren't a failing school, but we were marginal. We could have been a failing school. We were 100% universal lunch, high poverty area, and the state said, we're going to take a gamble on you, and they gave us $783,000, and that started the journey. And it was a 15-year journey until I retired. It was the fabric of what education should be. Because when you give children content, when you give teachers content, when you force leaders to know the content, you have a community. When you force parents to now become partners in their child's education because they're sitting at a dinner table and they're hearing their 2nd grader and their 6th grader and the 8th grader having a conversation that's not about SpongeBob, but they're discussing the Renaissance or westward expansion, or no, I want to study Hamlet, and we get books on different readability levels so all of you can study Hamlet, parents start coming to the school. What's going on with my child? I had no expectation that my child could reach this. We had a high foster population and a shelter right down the block from the school. I will say this, the school went from 560 children when we started Core Knowledge, and when I retired, we had 1,398 students. It is the tapestry of what education should be, and I say that because we know the paradigm shifts. I've lived through quite a few of them, as we all have. With every shift, the constant was the knowledge. Socrates said, I walked into a 6th grade class the first year, and a child said, well, Socrates says, none of us can ever have all the wisdom. And I looked around and I said, we're really going to have to be ongoing learners forever, and there's no end to what you can learn. What the outcome of buying into the idea of that children could understand content. It was the reality of they could understand it, and we didn't know as much as we needed to know to teach them. We all became a community of learners. And that tapestry got better and better and better. Because now the children, whether they be special ed, our ESL population, every subgroup population, all the schools around us were becoming SIR schools and focus schools and all of these other things, and we were making all our AMOs. And the reason was because of the content. And then when the Common Core Learning Standards came and there was this upheaval, we didn't miss a beat because it was just what we should have been doing all along and how children and teachers should learn. Is it easy work? No, but it is the most rewarding work because there's never an end to making a child inquisitive, curious. Once you make a kindergarten child curious, you'll get them through 8th grade and they'll look forward to high school and college because they are self-assured. So content knowledge for us has been a great journey. It continues for me now, even though I'm retired, and it also impacted upon practice of teachers. Once teachers learn how to teach content effectively, it is the very depth of who they are. Skill and content merge together. When the teacher effectiveness model came in New York State, and we have models all across the country now teaching and evaluating teachers, it was better to evaluate them. It was a fairer way to evaluate them because you were evaluating, do they have the knowledge to stand in front of the class, and what are those children giving, and do I have the knowledge to evaluate them, not based on a test, not based on one thing defining them. So my journey through content continues, even though I'm retired. It is a journey that if all of you start, you will never have a problem in education again.
So this is much too happy a discussion. The nation doesn't believe you. The nation is a heterogeneous society that rightly turned its back on the absolutism that it escaped from, turned its back on the core single narratives of Western Europe, Eastern Europe, other countries, has embraced a vision of education that is fundamentally skills-based, that is deeply skeptical. It doesn't need Hofstadter anymore to teach us that this is a country that is at its bones pragmatic and anti-intellectual, because ideas kill people, and pragmatics don't, largely. Do you find yourselves as educators aware of that greater context? Do you find pressure when you make curricular decisions that the politics push you hard on why those texts, why those subjects, why not this, why not that? Why are you creating a core curriculum, if you want to use that phrase? If E.D. Hirsch were here today, he could recall for us all I think it's the right word, the hatred that poured down over his head when he came with the original cultural literacy texts. So you are a small minority in a country that doesn't believe you. Have you faced any of this?
Yes. So in my opening comments, I talked about the challenges that our teachers face in just really having a deep understanding of the rich content that we're expecting them to teach. That is challenge one. I identified two other challenges that fall into, I think, what you're describing. First is this dominant philosophy of what's typically referred to as developmentally appropriate practice. And then the second, I would describe more of a social justice agenda, which might be a bit controversial to talk about.
Go for it.
But under the developmentally appropriate practice, there I have, generally seen in our desire to really protect these low-income, minority kids from learning these hugely complex documents like the Constitution, original texts that are rich in language and really long sentences. We have to not expose those kids because it's not developmentally appropriate, and we'd be doing damage somehow to their development. And it's a real issue in early education. and really getting teachers to get over it, and if they don't, we need to remove them from the house. Because it's one of the biggest impediments if fundamentally your teachers don't believe that kids should have access to this content, or worse, that it actually will do harm to them. So that's first. Second is the social justice agenda, which I think is more in the context of who are these generally white guys that we are deciding is the primary content that we should teach to low-income black and brown kids. Like, I remember having a discussion about Columbus, and one of our principals was like, we can't teach that. What about the Taino? And by the way, we do teach about the Taino, but the comment was, there's always this challenge, what's the moral equivalence or the historical equivalence of characters, and there just is a body of knowledge that exists, and we just have to own that as a country, as a school system. So I feel very lucky that I run a network of public charter schools where I can basically make that decision, and we can choose. And then those people who work for us can either choose that they're down for the program or they're not. But at some point, you have to choose the knowledge that is important that we need to impart to our children.
Okay. Any thoughts?
So I'll begin on the social justice aspect, because like he mentioned, it is difficult to teach a curriculum that is this rich and not have buy-in from parents.
Mm-hmm.
So when your child is coming home talking about ancient Greece in second grade, and the child next door that's going to your typical public school is learning about street signs, they're trying to figure out, well, what's the purpose. There's a basis that all kids should learn from, and you're trying to go above that without teaching them the basics. In my earnest to find something that I felt spoke to social justice and something that I felt that my kids could connect to, I did do my research with core knowledge, and I stumbled across the Grace Abounding text, which is an African American anthology, and in it has such depth, and it just really speaks to the heart of the African American community, and it's really something that my students have related to. So even though, according to core knowledge and the scope and sequence, it should be taught in 6th through 8th grade, I make it accessible to every single teacher from kindergarten on. And so just like core knowledge is something that's very rich, and I just really feel like it's up to the teacher to make sure that those pieces that seem to be out of reach for students, they now take it and own it and create it and put things together so that they are age appropriate, so that it's accessible to the entire student population.
I want to build upon your choice of Grace Abounding, if I might. By the way, David, no, I find myself suffering no criticism. I don't know what you're talking about. I think if we're going to recover, I want to try to say something potentially controversial, building what you just said. I think if we're going to recover the roots of intellectual richness in this country, we cannot neglect the sources of intellectual richness in this country with any casual European contempt, Professor Steiner. But those Americans, they're not intellectual, whatever. We're pragmatic and kind of dumb. No. But let's remember the religious foundations of this country, and let's not be afraid of them. I think that we have to think much more carefully about religious education and the religious community and religious schooling and its productive and powerful role in our society. What I mean by that is, I think we have much too lightly thought that when we lost at the university, including at some of the times, to speak of higher education for a minute, of great liveliness in the modern university, I'm speaking modern in an old-fashioned way in the 12th century, but the debate between reason and faith was extremely lively, and it crossed every single department, science, literature, everywhere. But everyone read the Bible with care and knew it with care. And that didn't lead to a merely superficial subscription to biblical principle. It led to an incredibly lively debate that spread throughout the fields of endeavor. At what price in the university have we lost shared texts that we read with reverence? At what loss of conversation in the modern university have we lost that? When you talk about sharing lesson plans, where they shared lesson plans? In the Hutchins era at the University of Chicago. There was a famous lesson about Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars where they talked about the difference between the Spartan tyrannical state and the Athens state, and they talked about their armies built on naval versus, and it was famous, and so many people will tell you about that lesson, that kind of precision. And it was not humiliating to a lot of this begins in higher education. The notion that if I don't make up my own thing and take a new approach as a teacher, that sharing is a reduction. But I think that I've been spending a lot of time with the religious community in America, with homeschoolers, with the evangelical community, and I think there's too much pressure sometimes to banish difference, rather than to wonder, are there gifts that a religious education, of productive solitude, of reading shared texts with reverence, that we might all learn from? And if we divorce ourselves from those traditions too blithely and not draw on their gifts, as I think your phrase, grace abounding, evidently does, I think we lose an anchor in this discussion.
So, of course, yes, but I seem to be the person who has to bring in the world here. You are part of an examination regime that has published guidelines, every one of you, Park, Smarter Balanced, everyone else, where I will list the topics that you cannot put on a public exam, starting with God, including death, disease, any serious moral debate. You're not going to sit here and say that this is a country open to deep intellectual discourse when the very way in which we test our students has banished serious thought. By rule. This is a fundamental anti-intellectual act, and the way we teach is defined, I'm sorry, by the way we test.
Absolutely.
You are sitting here as a representative of that regime, and you cannot pretend that this doesn't exist. We cannot have a serious examination in this country because we can't put serious essay topics in our exams.
Welcome to advanced placement, Dr. Steiner.
Yes, and how much of the percentage of the American population take
But
it?
if you ask about the College Board, we need to own that, because this is friendly. David and I are having a friendly family dinner table style conversation here. But I do want to say something fairly profound here. The College Board's deepest work, perhaps, has been in advanced placement, where content creates community among teachers, which I think you've both been hinting at. I think that the words of sameness you use will freak people out some about the same lesson plan. But I think that, no, I'm just telling you, I know that that'll happen, but I'm telling you one thing about AP. We just gave an AP exam where the question on AP US history was to document the rise of religious right. And there were texts that had lots of God in it, and kids had to draw upon their earliest foundations and religious texts from the founding, and all sorts of things. This is all open in advanced placement, and it earns you college credit. What about, and I don't mean to be self-preserving here, thinking about that as a new, you say that's for some kids, but all kids are aiming at that. All kids are aiming at first-year college courses. And so when I think of revising SAT and PSAT, I'm actually looking towards that model, where can we begin to build teacher community earlier around content in courses. And so I think, David, I am worried, but I also think we have to look at what we've got. And
All right,
AP
one
is
more
respected.
remark, and then back to the more important people. When I looked at the AP, and this is just a few years ago, I looked at Latin, Spanish, and American literature. Latin, I recognize Latin. Set texts, real content. You could study them deeply in advance. And you know why? Because Latin doesn't matter. Then we got to Spanish. List of authors, small excerpts, essays, right? Not quite what Latin was, but still some texts, because Spanish matters a little bit more than Latin, and so you have to be more careful. American literature, no set text whatsoever. The more important the exam, the more contempt for content.
Perhaps, but we have uncontroversially, as you may have noted, revised AP US history. Did anyone see that go down? Speaking of a lack of controversy. And what we said in the new design is the following. It's fascinating. We actually said the founding documents And the conversation they inspire, we listed 10 of them. 10. Do you know how many kids take AP US History in this country? Quite a few. We listed 10 documents that repaid special attention in the text. That was because what teachers, I just want to tell you why. How are we able to do this? First thing is, we did it poorly in our first attempt and much better in our second one. I think the revised edition is far stronger and better and honors American history, but also honors, we recommend a month studying those documents. That's a moment of depth. We have not yet redesigned American literature or English literature. We're waiting till our assessment development can answer the kind of rich, open-ended items. We need to do that with more care. So that's an interesting problem we face. But we have redesigned those exams. And so the College Board redesign, though, was forced by the following issue. We found what happened, and I want all of you who believe in content knowledge to confront this. I think there's another problem. I think these content lists get way too long. I think what David's describing about that long list versus the short one, when I see a lot of the knowledge stuff, it's so long that what happens is people race through it. And what we found in AP is we unfortunately imitated first-year college courses, which had become these racing surveys. So the American history redesign, do you know that we went from 35 multiple choice questions to 19, each with texts in front of them, and focused on topics. David knows the kind of heat we got for this. But you're right, David. You're so right to say that AP used to be. It imitated that kind of superficial, by naming no content, you have to race through all of it, and that's exactly the problem we face.
Just to digress a little,
Please,
a few minutes
rescue
ago,
me.
when we talk about how content gets done, you have to make a choice as a leader and as educators. Are we going to teach our children? Are we going to test our children? Our school, we taught our children. And the results showed themselves later on. Should we be testing third grade students? No. Should we wait, like Finland does, until they're much older and have that basis of core knowledge? Yes. But when you say why this is not getting across the country, because people are judged by that one thing. That one data point that comes out in literacy, that one data point in math, and all the new leaders, they're not going to stand up. They can't. And the superintendents can't, and the chancellors can't, because everybody is not giving it time. If we gave our children time, so that by the time they took AP tests, they were ready to take it. When you walk into classrooms, I remember my last year, and this is one of the reasons why I decided to leave, because I couldn't stand another paradigm shift. It was enough already. And I didn't have the people to back me anymore, because they knew I was crazy, and they were retiring, and I said, I can't do this alone. But when I would walk in the classroom, knowing the kids had great content knowledge, they were doing brilliant things all year, and I'd walk in the classroom to give them a pep talk. And out of 860 children we tested a year, you'd walk into classrooms, children would be crying. That's not what education is. So as a leader, if you stand up and you teach the content, and not only, we started with the core knowledge content, but we just went off after years of mastering the planning, the instructional rounds, the working together and everything. We were able to bring in everything to celebrate and support every culture. But back to you, it's the testing issue. As leaders today, leaders' jobs depend upon testing. Teachers' jobs depend upon testing. And unfortunately, since the Common Core Learning Standards, which were wonderful, the tests that went along were terrible testing tools. And when you do that to children and you pull the rug out from under teachers, it's about their future.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I worked at the White House during the time that the No Child Left Behind legislation was being developed, and it's just interesting what has occurred, because when those discussions, at least in my view, were happening around accountability and just wanting to ensure that our children could read and do math, the intent wasn't that the effect of that should be a narrowing of the curriculum by which we don't teach anything else. I think that's how the sector responded, as seemingly that, I guess we have to have, 360 minutes, per week, or ridiculous numbers of amount of time dedicated to ELA and math during the week, and social studies, science, history, the arts, music, goes
Or
by the
languages.
wayside. So somehow that was the reaction to accountability, and it is difficult. These are what the states, the tests measure, but I just think as educators, we have to stand up. Like, we're taking a bet that actually it's the opposite, that actually broadening our curriculum. I remember when I said to our board, we were going from 2 30-minute science blocks, science blocks per week, to science 5 days a week, 60 to 90 minutes. Like, whoa, what about literacy? I'm like, well, science is literacy. You look at the vocabulary that is happening during these science blocks, and look at the level of engagement and curiosity. And so I think somehow it's the educator response to, because the tests themselves, I mean, we're making the bet that actually exposing our children to this broad curriculum with teachers that have deep content knowledge, hopefully that will result in kids acing these tests, which really should be easy, regardless of what passages are put in front of them.
Thank you. I'm going to open this up to the audience. I just want to say that while we're here to discuss this topic, it really is this topic, and I would love to have your thoughts on content and curriculum, and so please make it a question. I always say that, and not a speech. We're already in trouble with Peter. So.
I once ran a little panel in my small school district on the question of academic improvement, and I went around the room and a discussion about content and asked a teacher, wouldn't you prefer to have your plumber know Shakespeare? And he said, no. Could you give the argument to us utilitarian Americans, do we want to know what the street signs say, or do we want to know what the Declaration of Independence say? What is the argument that you can give to people to say, this is why you need to read Dostoevsky or Shakespeare?
Everyone is a citizen regardless of what job they do. Jobs change now. This is the great fiction of narrow career readiness. It was once true that specialized skill in a largely unchanging field could protect and secure you. No longer. Jobs change enough within fields and across them that a narrow specialty without the ability to read, write with care, and learn new things, you're helpless.
And even if jobs didn't change, it's a rich life knowing Shakespeare. Let's say you had the same job for years. Why wouldn't you want to know Shakespeare? It's a rich life. It's not just about employment.
Other thoughts, questions? Yes. Mike's coming.
There's a community you didn't talk about in this discussion, and those are students with language disabilities that are delayed in reading and can't access content. So
Can't?
Well, can't until they have great teachers that know how to teach them with multisensory learning approaches, which isn't really taught in teaching colleges. So I want to know what kind of things your schools or you're thinking about to do for kids with dyslexia that are very late in decoding and reading.
Sure.
I think asking Linda any good question is always a good idea.
This is Linda from Core Knowledge.
Okay, so I'm the president of the Core Knowledge Foundation. My background is as a special education teacher working with those kids. What I realized when I was working with kids with language disabilities is the way that I learned to teach those students was the way that we ought to be teaching all students. And so to your point of what about kids that can't read? They don't have the decoding skills yet. One of the things that we have certainly latched onto that it's not unique to Core Knowledge. Student Achievement Partners, lots of others now are talking about read-alouds with young children. And the notion that you have to wait until children are able to decode the words is just, there's a faulty premise there. We know that listening comprehension outpaces students' ability. I mean, it's common sense. Do, young children understand what they hear long before they're able to read on their own? So why would we not share complex text, interesting content with young children, but do it in a way that does not require them to use the cognitive capacity of, learning to read is hard. I was in schools today where little ones, kindergartners and first graders, are learning those decoding skills, but they're also being exposed to rich, coherent content knowledge and to hear the conversations that those children have. Is absolutely incredible to hear the conversations that English language learners have. Sorry, enough.
And I would just add, full transparency, I just have a violent reaction anytime I hear an adult, start a sentence where the kids can't access the content because of, and then name the suffix, language disabilities, poverty. They're from their first generation, they're this race, they're from this income. Just name the list of things and you can suddenly tick off every checkbox and suddenly you're not teaching anything. Let's just protect them from all this rich content because they've got all these disabilities. We can't expect this of the kids. They've got a language disability, for heaven's sake. Yeah, exactly, right. There's strategies that you can deploy, but you don't change the original purpose of what we're trying to do. And I think oftentimes the result is that the adults diminish the expectation as opposed to modify their strategy.
I think one thing that we should all be careful of in a crime of assessment is to conflate quick with smart. That is, we've been doing a lot of work at the College Board to slow things down. And one thing you mentioned was dyslexia. And I do think that we should take more pleasure in slow reading, like slow food. And I'll tell you something heartbreaking. So we took an exam that had 35, remember I told you 35 multiple choice down to 19? And you'd think that was a gift to those slower readers and those kids at the borders. They raced through it. We did pilots. The weakest kids raced through the exam because they consider reading a disposable act, a quick thing. I know, Alan, you know this very well. In other words, you have to train someone to use that time. You have to train them to trust their slower instincts and to return to something rather than just go through it. But I do think that this overuse of speed and smart together is very destructive to our shared aims.
If I'm allowed to introduce a European thinker to this conversation, Hans-Georg Gadamer, arguably one of the greatest thinkers after Heidegger in Germany, once said that if you read a book only once, you're condemned to read the same book always, by which he meant that if you are a skimming reader, the only thing you're looking for is confirmation of bias. And you'll either find it or you won't. And when you won't, you'll stop reading in any serious way. So we're absolutely at one. The entire culture, of course, is premised on speed.
Yeah.
And so we are fighting a very difficult battle. Yes, right at the front. Mike's coming.
So I love this idea of slow reading. Very much, but I do have to ask the questions about the relationship of this rich content and the need, particularly in the younger grades, to really slow down to get it. And we're all educators here in New York, I assume, and the ELA exams last year, and for the last 2 years, particularly in grade 5, where there's literally no way. I read the exam to a 5th grader, and there's just no way that they can read with care for the number of passages, and I feel like we're being irresponsible if we don't discuss that.
The one advantage of the New York test versus, let's say, Park or Smarter Balanced is that it does belong to the state, and so it can be revised. And I do hope that with the new commissioner, that she will be open to this kind of serious critique.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like slight dismay at the fact that we've gone through 2 rounds of it now. And I'm an ardent believer in the standards.
Right.
And we're core knowledge schools and in all this, but at the same time, I feel like there really has been, I believe, a lot of suffering that's happened for 2 years.
Yeah.
Like we've
Can
had
I
2
throw out
years,
another
and
kind of
so
principle?
they're changing now, maybe,
Yeah.
Right.
but
I so, as someone who's responsible for later exams, I so feel we need to own it. Like, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll tell you another aspect of it. like providing droll, low quality, in other words, boring stuff you'd never want to read does not make a reading test more reliable, just if you want to know the science. So my proudest moments, it's, what if you said it is absolutely our responsibility to provide kids things worth reading? And my happiest moment, we just gave the revised PSAT for the first time this fall, is kids were tweeting about the passages that they actually interested them. And it's fascinating because they felt it was fairer. Isn't that like kind of interesting? So you're right about length. I've kind of said to you, we're re-examining it in everything we do. And you're so right to call us to question on this. But it's also about, if a test is only going to have 5 or 6 passages on it, why shouldn't they be remarkable? Why shouldn't it be an honor to be selected? Why don't we raise our game so that the kinds of things on these exams are worthy of imitation? You know what I'm trying to say? Like, I think you guys should be pushing so hard that the assessment community has to be so much better to take responsibility for the consequences of its actions.
Great. At the back. Whoops, stop.
Hi. Oh, there I am. My name is Tamosa Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Achievement Network. I have a twofold question. Mr. Rowe, you had mentioned earlier the importance of not underestimating the role of intellectual preparedness and in supporting teachers' content knowledge. And my question is really about the new cadre of teachers coming into the profession, and to what degree we believe that teacher preparation programs are adequately preparing them for the skill set that they require to have the level of depth of content area knowledge to appropriately teach. So that's part one of the question. Part two of the question is, given the expectations around the vast content array that schools are required to demonstrate proficiency around on summative assessments, how do you think about, and this is open to the panel as well, how do you think about prioritization and focus around teacher content area preparedness in your own professional development program?
So for us, and I did speak about it in my opening comment, so one of our realizations was that we were designing what we thought to be a fantastic curriculum that was rich in U.S. history, world history, science, the deeper requirements of math is required by the Common Core, and we simply came to the conclusion that particularly in elementary school, our teachers were struggling to teach it, particularly our newer teachers. Although in some ways our newer teachers were more hungry to learn. So that was something. So there was more of a growth mindset, frankly, to use an overused term at the moment. But so we found more of a hunger. But in terms of formal preparedness, it's really disappointing. And not only in the knowledge, also in writing. We found that's a really challenge. Like when we ask our teachers to essentially take the assessments that we want our students to do so that they can hopefully create the exemplar, it's pretty surprising. So that's something we spend a lot of time in our professional development in writing and hopefully giving enough time to our faculty well before they're teaching a unit, that they see the texts, they see the end assessment. We see what is the critical question, what is the assessment that we're going to be asking at the end, what are 3 or 4 exemplars of what a fantastic student response would look like. So we feel like all of those things hopefully will create the package and hopefully just give them time to get smart on the content itself. And I forget your second question. But
hand it over.
I definitely feel that teachers are not prepared, only because if you ask a teacher that's coming from a school that did student teaching, what was the curriculum, they will cite a scripted program. So if you're now bringing a brand new teacher into an environment where there is a set curriculum and you have all of this rich content, they have a very difficult time, because core knowledge does give you the how, it does give you the what, but it does not give you the how. So when teachers come in, they're expecting that this scripted program there should be something there that's going to take them from step A through C, but they're not really understanding the need for them to create that authentic material from the rich, content. So I think, unfortunately, a lot of the teacher programs are not preparing them, and it's really a disadvantage to the students.
Very quickly.
And just add, and by saying all these things, I'm definitely not implying that our teachers aren't smart, or capable, but it's just like our kids, right? If they're not exposed to knowledge in a coherent, cumulative fashion, their knowledge base won't increase unless someone is deliberately building that with them.
Therefore, there has to be a lot of professional development that's done at the school level.
And you develop a differentiated learning community because there are people that have that content
Yeah.
knowledge. So they become the leaders of those that don't on a grade or cross grades. But ultimately what happens is even the one that has the expertise needs to be taken to their next level. So when you do your professional development plans, they are differentiated based on the entry point and also what the teachers themselves realize. There were many times that myself and my assistant principal sat in classes with our history teachers or our science teachers. Because as Ian said, we had science 5 days a week. We had social studies 5 days a week. And we got the initial pushback, well, where's your 90-minute literacy block? I'm sorry, they're reading books, they're thinking, they're making interdisciplinary connections. But it goes to a tremendous amount of professional development, well thought out professional development, linked with instructional rounds. Because when people start coming into your classroom and sharing their practice based on the thing that they have to improve, everybody gets better.
We've got a huge challenge in ed schools. One of my earlier positions was Dean at the School of Education here at Hunter, and we put 700 teachers a year into schools, which is a huge multiplier effect. One of the great challenges is that in this country, if you're preparing to be an elementary school teacher, you can take just about any major you want. And many of those majors have absolutely no relationship to what you're going to be teaching. And I think the assumption that somehow elementary school is devoid, right, of content has been one of the great damages, again, at the risk of bringing in somewhere else in the world. France has a pre-K program, historically called École Maternelle, which was used with very poor children in France and Algerian immigrants. Unlike Head Start, with that program, the gaps closed and stayed closed. And the great difference between that program and many of the Head Start, not all of them, but many of the Head Start experiments, is that that program was almost ruthlessly content-rich. And it fed into a content-rich curriculum, a national content-rich curriculum. It was the great equalizer. There was no embarrassment about it. And I think that the way we think about teaching has moved so far over to a set of pedagogical skills to prepare children to find the main idea, right? That we've built a consistent system that is consistently bad.
And again, nothing wrong with finding the main idea, but let's just do that with really rich text in a coherent sequence.
Go ahead. Just wait for the mic. Thanks.
So during the conversation, I heard a lot about changing the curriculum or changing the content. Who decides what to teach and what to test on?
For me, we followed the core knowledge sequence. So it was what was planned out for a year-long plan. But after 3 years, when we had rolled out everything, then we built on it asking the students, what's the next step? What didn't you learn that you want to learn? Or what did you learn, but it's taking you in a different direction? So it comes from leadership and teachers and students and sometimes parents.
Great. Go ahead.
It should be more parents, but it's not.
In risk of controversy, I'll give an example of what I think doesn't work in that. I don't think it's okay to say a kid has to learn something because it is on the test. So let me give you a cardinal example of this. So when you ask who has the right to decide what's on an SAT, I'll try to keep it super simple. We looked at a bunch of research as to what students use most often in first-year college courses. And we found that 3 areas of math are overwhelmingly, it's a great rescue of math. Math is both really hard, but there are a couple of areas of it that if you get really good at them, you use them over and over. It's evident. We could get into the details, but they are there. It is evident the founding documents and the Great Conversation are resonant throughout our society and used more often. The only text that's comparable probably is the Bible, but it's evident that they are singular in that way, which gave us the opportunity. As a counterexample are SAT words. So SAT words are words that are defined. If I would ask you to define one, you might say they are words you have likely not heard before and likely shall not hear again. And you call them SAT words because the only place you reliably can find them is on an SAT.
Or Scrabble.
Or Scrabble. Ian, your inner nerdiness is already apparent. No need to talk about your favorite game in front of all these people. But just to say it, that's not okay. It is not okay to say to a population of students that in order to get into college, you suddenly have to master a potentially endless list of obscure words. And I think we have, again, responsibility as assessment providers to own the panic we have induced by setting those kinds of challenges and deciding, no, we're going to limit ourselves to assessing only those things students are already learning in classes and that they will use over and over again to succeed. So for that kid who might not buy into all this, it's evident to them that it's powerful.
One more. Go ahead.
Watch yourselves, friends. This is a reporter.
I wanted to ask about
You're
the
welcome.
New York City, thanks, public schools. The chancellor has, the current chancellor has a long history with Teachers College and balanced literacy and the kind of workshop model there that a lot of people say is kind of counter to core knowledge. And so I'm just curious if the panelists and Mr. Coleman, if they think that that's preparing students for the Redesign SAT, for AP classes, if they're getting the content they need with that approach at the chancellor.
I'd prefer to cede that to people who are doing the work in New York, that one. Any thoughts? No, just in all candor. That question requires knowledge I don't have.
Do you want to balance literacy? I'll be honest.
Yeah.
Honestly, because
Like which one else?
balanced literacy has been around for a long time. It's like anything else. You tweak it. You make it fit. So while there was the balanced literacy approach and all the components to it, we tweaked it so that it would run simultaneously to the content we wanted to teach. So nothing is set. So if you're reading, doing a read aloud on Westwood Expansion, and then you go into the shared reading and everything, you can do that with content. It's very easy to do it. And the Writers' Workshop was something that at the beginning gave us a strong foundation because all of our assessments for the 15 years that I was there was writing. You knew what children, how they developed their skills, how it was embedded in their writing, how they thought about it and assimilated what you taught them. So everything that we did revolved around the writing assessment. So just like balanced literacy is the push now, and my daughter's a teacher in New York, and when she used to come to my school, she'd say, "You're crazy." She said that at my retirement party. She said, "This is crazy, teachers can't do this." Because she's in a school that's strictly teachers' college, and they feel that they don't have enough time. So there's going to have to be, at some point, a policy change where we can open the door for more content to be taught within the framework, if that's what your school's doing, with balanced literacy.
All right, one more. Go ahead. People.
Real knowledge, real mastery, artistry, if I may use, of any content. So is there any, I have a question for those of you that are involved even in policy making, is there any pressure to the testing community to redesign this test, even in terms of the timing of the test? Because I find 5th grade testing, or some schools start even earlier, absolutely aggressive. Not helping the children. With the schools I work with and with my own children, I sense a panic attack every time those tests come around. And then another thing that I want to ask is, anybody in this country talks about oral examination ever?
So I've tried to answer a couple of times, so I don't want to repeat that. I think at the College Board we have to take responsibility for notions of time, for examining things worth doing. But I want to throw out another idea that is slightly different, but maybe worth considering. I think assessment without opportunity is dead. That the redesign of the exams themselves is not nearly enough. It has to be worth something to kids and families. People aren't buying it anymore that you should take it because you must. That works obviously in advanced placement where kids earn college credit. It creates the right kind of, you might say, coalition or conspiring between the teacher and student where they both seek together to earn something that is demanded of them and demanding for them. And we're trying to bring that into PSAT, as I mentioned, the $180 million of additional scholarships. But we also found, just as a quick example, that many kids who do very well at SAT, who should find diamonds in the rough, but are poor. So if they're bottom quartile of income, top 10% of achievement, half of those athletes don't apply to a single selective college. So whoops, the assessment did not provide opportunity. So what we did is we give them now today all fee waivers to apply to college when they get back their scores. And it's my favorite day at the College Board is when they're given, because a kid, yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And a kid posted them on Instagram and he wrote, College Board sent me fee waivers because I am awesome. And he did not say because he was poor. And so I think those of us involved in assessment have a bigger debt than making the exams briefer or better. We also have to link them very much more concretely to tangible opportunities that are actually delivered to kids.
We should close with some content. If we mortals have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear, and this weak and idle theme no more yielding than a dream. Thank you so much.